king of the cloud forests. So yesterday we'd found out that Uncle Sung and Ashley had arrived in England and were living with Grandma. At home in Iddlesleigh Road with Grandma, Uncle Sung and Porter, and with the extended family of aunts and uncles and cousins, always in and out, I was happy enough. Though it was hard to get used to there being no sky outside my window. All I could see from my bedroom was the backyard, the coal shed, the privy, that's a toilet to you and I, and the backs of more houses that blocked out all but the midday sun, and there was little enough of that. There were few opportunities to talk to Uncle Sung alone or in secret. It was a small house, and anyway, he was busy looking for Grandma. There seemed little prospect now of our ever discovering the identity of my predecessor amongst the Yetis. We simply did not know where or how to begin the search. More than once, Uncle Sung encouraged me to tell Grandma everything and to show her the photograph. He was sure we could trust her with our secret, but I was adamant. I would trust no one. I kept the coronation tin hidden in the bottom of my chest of drawers and under the drawer liner, and each night I took it out and pondered over it. I even bought some tobacco once and lit the pipe and smoked it just to see what would happen. It made me sick. That was all. Potter and I became inseparable. I think it was because I would walk him every day down to the river and talk to him. He loved to be talked to. It made him feel important. Much to Grandma's disgust, he would often come to sleep on my bed at night. She was a stickler for cleanliness. My ears and fingernails were checked every night before bed. I could not escape baths, no matter how hard I tried, much to Uncle Sung's amusement. School was a torture to me. The formalities and regimentation I found there were alien to me. There was a severity and stiffness about the teachers that I feared, and the early inquisitiveness of my fellow pupils soon turned to naked aggression as my shortcomings were revealed one by one. I knew no French, no Latin. Even my English I spoke and spelt differently from them. They soon found out that I had no father, no mother, only Uncle Sung, and I will not repeat what they said of him whenever he walked with me to school. It was Uncle Sung's Christmas present to me that marked me out forever as an outcast at school. He had made me another quilted Tibetan coat. My old one was in tatters. I remember it was snowing heavily the morning I put it on to go into school. In the cloakroom I was surrounded by a mob of mocking, taunting faces. Coat of many colours, they called it. Know what happened to Joseph, don't you? And they began to pull it off me, tearing the sleeve. Fortunately, the bell went, and no more harm was done. But worse was to come. At break, I was called before the headmaster, who told me the coat would have to be confiscated. It was not school uniform, he said. He sent me to fetch it. When I reached the cloakroom, it was deserted. I found what was left of my coat strewn around the floor in pieces. I could not keep back the tears of anger and hurt that came to my eyes. I knew then I could never be one of them. After that, I sought out no friends, and none came to me. In the classroom, I succeeded at nothing, but I excelled on the sports field. I found I could run faster and jump further and higher than anyone else in school. I put this down to my time amongst the Yetis, but far from attracting the admiration of my fellows, this only served to inflame their resentment of me, so I ran slower to divert their hostility. But the damage had already been done, and it was too late for any reconciliation. The outbreak of war in September 1939 was a new excitement and one that I welcomed, for the new boy of uncertain origins, Joseph they called me now, was forgotten. At last they left me alone. Even so, I was always glad to be sick and off school, and I was frequently. The change of climate, Grandma thought, but she was wrong. I was even relieved when the doctor diagnosed glandular fever and said I would have to stay home in bed for a few weeks. The fever worsened, and Uncle Sung moved his bed into my room and was beside me day and night. I would not now be parted from the coronation tin, although Uncle Sung took care to hide it away from prying eyes or visitors. Whether the coronation tin was the talisman that cured me, or whether it was the doctor, I do not know, but the fever left me at last. During my convalescence I was lavished with affection. Delegations of adoring relatives would visit me each day. Grandma kept me supplied with piles of books from the library, and I became an avid reader of Robert Louis Stevenson, Walter Scott, and Rider Haggard. Both she and Uncle Sung would take turns to read to me when I was weak. It was a peculiar illness that left me feeling alternately quite recovered and then, suddenly, unwell again. But I was happier than I had been since my time amongst the Yetis. Porter scarcely left the end of my bed, more attentive than any nurse, Grandma said. I didn't really want to get better, but I did. The doctor came less and less frequently, and then I was allowed out of bed so long as I stayed in my room and kept warm. He would come once more, he said, for the last check-up. The doctor was old and very deaf, so he shouted when he spoke and was inclined to repeat himself. I suspected he must have believed that everyone was as deaf as he was. I liked him because he was interested in Porter. He spent as much time in petting Porter as he did examining me. "Fine dog," he would say. I said, "He's a fine dog, this one. What's he called?" I said, "What's he called?" And I tell him the upteenth time. "Water? Water? Funny name for a dog." I said, "It's a funny name for a dog." I honestly do not know why I had the coronation tin out that last time the doctor came. Uncle Sung had warned me often enough to keep it hidden under my pillow during the daytime. Whatever the reasons, I never heard the knock on the front door downstairs, never heard him coming up the stairs. I was sitting cross-legged on the edge of the bed, considering the photo and thinking the young priest had strangely large hands for his size, when I heard him on the landing outside the door. "You needn't come up, Mrs. Carpenter," he said. "I can find my own way up by now. I just had time to climb into bed and stuff the coronation tin under my pillow before he came in. I was sitting forward, holding up my pyjama top so he could tap my back, when the tin somehow slipped out from behind me and crashed to the floor. The photograph came to rest at his feet. It landed upside down. He finished listening to me and then crouched down. He put the knife and the pipe back in the tin and handed it to me. "Smoking a pipe at your age?" He laughed, and he bent down to pick up the photograph. He scarcely gave it a glance before putting it down on my top of my library books. He packed away his stethoscope and clicked his bag shut. "You'll be fine enough now, Ashley," he said, and he turned to go. "Back to school next week." He had opened the door and was almost gone before he stopped suddenly and turned round. He walked back to the bedside table and picked up the photograph. "I thought so," he said. "A housey boy." And then he looked more closely. "Good gracious! Where did you get this?" It was at that moment that Grandma came in with Uncle Sung. The doctor was shaking his head. "Incredible! Incredible! I'm almost sure I was at school with him. Same house we were. Yes, it is him. It is. You never forget your school friends, and certainly not this one." Grandma was beside the bed now, and the doctor handed her the photograph. "You know who he is, Mrs. Carpenter. That's Big Ed. Edward Lely, or Sir Edward Lely as he is now, Nobel Prize winner, medicine." Sir Edward Lely, I could hear again the last plaintive cry of the Yetis. That must be his father and mother, I suppose. Don't remember them, of course, but the boy looks about your grandson's age, Mrs. Carpenter. Bit older, perhaps. Come to think of it, he's not at all unlike him now. "Not at all. Remarkable," I said. "He's not at all unlike your grandson, Mrs. Carpenter." "Well, I never. Big Ed. We called him Big Ed on account of his brains and his size, you know. It's him, I swear it is. Not a face you'd forget." "What's he dressed up like that for?" asked Grandma. "Some kind of seminary, is it?" "Certainly not. My school uniform, that was. Blue coat, yellow stockings, bands, housey. Christ Hospital, CH, always called it. I remembered then the initials on the photograph. We were there together, went to medical school together, St Thomas's, up in London. Went our separate ways after that, lost touch. I became a humble GP and he was always brilliant. Went into research, circulatory disorders. Brilliant he was. Retired now, lost his mind for a bit. I heard, too clever for his own good perhaps, but he's one of the greatest medical men of our generation, no doubt about that. Yes, and come to think about it, he lives down here in the West Country somewhere, Honiton way, I think. Haven't seen him for over 40 years or more. But that's him. I'd stake my life on it. Grandma glanced up suddenly and caught the look of panic and helplessness in my eyes. She frowned. The doctor went on. You know him, do you? He said. You know him? I shook my head. Then where did you get the photograph? I said. Where did you get the photograph? Found it, I said feebly, and then in a library book. I was pleased with that touch of desperate inspiration. Probably used it as a bookmark, I shouldn't wonder. Well, you'd best send it back to him. Somewhere around Honiton he lives. Shouldn't be difficult to find. If you put a little note with it, remember me to him, will you? Incredible. Quite incredible. And he was gone out of the door, chuckling and shaking his head. See myself out, he called, and we heard the front door close. I dared not look up, for I could feel Grandma's eyes on me. Which book? She said at last, and I could not answer. I think your grandmother should know, Uncle Sung said, come round the bed and sitting down beside me. She won't believe me, I said. Why don't you try me, said Grandma, arranging my pillows behind me. I'm a good listener. And so she proved. Porter slept soundly through my story, but then I had already told him all about Red, little Red, Shoe, Whitebeard and Tot, and the others many times. At the end of it, he woke up with a jolt as Grandma stood up. Well, there's only one thing for it, she said. We must go and see him, mustn't we? It's his photograph, isn't it? His pipe, his knife, his tin. Besides, there's still a few things I don't quite understand. The next morning, after a sleepless night, I climbed into Aunt Edith's little black car with Grandma and Uncle Sung, and we set off for Honiton. Aunt Edith talking all the way. Of the rest of us, only Grandma talked, and then only to give directions. She had quite easily found out where the old man lived. He wasn't in the telephone directory, but a friend of hers who worked on the local paper, the Western Morning News, had made some discreet inquiries. I suppose I should have been excited at the prospect of meeting the real Lily at long last. I'd wondered about the young man in the photograph for so long, but I was filled rather with a terrible dread in the pit of my stomach as the car turned through the white gates and rattled down the drive. Aunt Edith's grizzly fox fur swinging hypnotically in front of me. The car came to a halt beside a stone porch where bracken and grass grew out of the stonework. Stay in the car, Edith, said Grandma, and when Aunt Edith objected, she snapped at her with her eyes, and Aunt Edith said no more. Grandma rang the bell, and Uncle Sung and I waited behind her in the porch. I remember Uncle Sung put his arm around me and patted my shoulder. He always knew how I felt. There were sharp footsteps, and then the door handle turned and the door opened. Yes, the old lady whose face peered out at us spoke in a reedy voice, her eyes staring at us in alarm. Sir Edward Leali's house, Grandma said. He's not well, came the reply. He doesn't see anyone. And the door began to close. Grandma pushed her cane against the door. I think you'll find he'll see us, she said, and ignoring the protestations, she walked into the darkness of the hallway, supported by Uncle Sung. I followed, clutching the coronation tin. The place smelt of pipe smoke and floor polish. Grandma took the coronation tin out of my hand and gave it to the old lady. I believe this belongs to him. Say we are returning it and wish to speak to him. Tell him we will wait.